citizen.
Out of many
we are world citizens. Same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voices.
Welcome.
Oh, you know
I'm
we got
Arthur
something
Kanigis,
to
the
say.
host
All
of
we
the
need is the same
People-Powered
direction,
Planet
heading in one
podcast,
way.
where each week we have amazing solutionaries talking about creative ways that we can actually preserve, protect, and thrive on planet Earth. It's easy to get very depressed about the ocean of darkness, the vast number of negative things happening in our world that threaten our very existence as a species. Here's where we talk about how we fix it, how we the people can have the power to actually make a difference and to actually, in practical ways, make it possible for our grandchildren and future generations to survive and thrive. And today, we have a very, very special guest with us, one of the grandfathers of the movement. Now, many of you know that Garry Davis was kind of a granddad of the movement, someone who inspired so many people with his bold acts of courage. Many of you have seen our movie called "The World Is My Country." If you haven't, just go to theworldismycountry.com and you'll get to see it. But René is also part of that very early generation. At 87 years old, he has been an incredible light to the movement for world citizenship. He's the only remaining living member of the group that originally started the Earth Constitution, a constitution for the whole planet Earth. Wow, we're going to hear a little more about that as the program goes on. But let me first introduce him a little more. He is president of the Association of World Citizens. And boy, they have been going on for just nonstop with incredible articles and information for how we improve our world, how we make it possible to thrive on planet Earth. And that organization has official consultative status at the UN's Economic and Social Council. Later in the podcast, we're going to talk more about that and ask him some questions about amazing campaign for Don't Choose Extinction. We'll talk more about that. And we'll also ask him some questions about how he first met Garry Davis in some very unusual circumstances in a machine shop of all places. You'll find out more about that, or with a machinist. But first, at the home of a machinist. First, let me say a little more about him. He's a graduate and professor and director of research of the Graduate Institute of Development Studies in Geneva. He is a Princeton guy, and he's both taught there and went there. And he was part of the group that helped with the University of Chicago, that helped to derive early ideas about how we create a constitution for the world and so on. So without further ado, let me welcome René Wadlow. Glad to have you here on our program.
I'm very happy to be with you all, and I'm looking forward to our discussion and to raise both some of the history of past efforts, but basically turning toward what we must do these days. And as you know, the climate conference is going on these days in Scotland, and the challenges that we face as humanity are very real, and we've got to think as how we can work together in order to meet these challenges which we all face.
We are facing seemingly insurmountable problems, and sometimes I know can feel hopeless. I know even Greta Thunberg said that sometimes she feels burned out. You can't get these government leaders to move and change things, and they seem to talk but not act. How is it possible? What is a way that we can actually, what is the key to how we do actually save our world?
I believe that non-governmental organizations have a very real role to play. When one is working as an NGO, one is also aware of the limitations of the power of governments, of the pressures that governments can play in, unfortunately, a good number of countries. NGOs are under a great deal of pressure. In fact, or sometimes put in prison, sometimes assassinated, etc. Nevertheless, those of us who are privileged to live in democratic states and who have access to embassies of the UN, embassies of governments at the UN, we try to present ideas, to discuss with them, to raise in the Commission on Human Rights violations that go on. So I have, while realistic as to our limitations, great hope in the work of non-governmental organizations and in cooperation among non-governmental organizations. It's certain that when a certain number of groups come together and say the same thing, it has an impact perhaps greater than when it's only a single organization.
How does the idea of seeing ourselves as world citizens give us greater power to be able to make change in the world and to create a survivable future?
The idea of world citizenship opens a door to raise issues of any state or any part of the world. Very often, many non-governmental organizations are national organizations and who are directed toward the parliament of that particular state. And they have a very real role to play. I'm in close contact with the Friends Committee on National Legislation in the United States, which supports a certain number of bills within Congress. On the other hand, being a world citizen organization, we this particular week have written to the authorities in Brazil on the way in which the country has not dealt adequately with the COVID-19 issue. The same way we have written both to the authorities in Poland and in Belarus about the immigration or the immigrants who are caught between the two countries, who are suffering, who are being pushed back by the Polish government, etc. So that our legitimacy is as world citizens and not as a Polish NGO or a Belarusian NGO or an American NGO. We have people from many different parts of the world, and we get answers from the governments. I don't want to say thanking us, but nobody writes and says, this is none of your business.
Well, in terms of what is our business as citizens of this world, I noticed that you were part of that original, as I mentioned, creation of a constitution for the earth. Is part of the reason, I mean, it seems like here you are trying to stop this problem in this country, this one over here, this one over there. Is there a key to all of it? Does the key lie in the idea that we need to create a whole new governing system for our planet? And is this part of what you were trying to do when you way back in 1947 or so started working on an Earth, 47, 48, that area, or at least that's when they were starting at the University of Chicago to work on an Earth Constitution? Do you see somehow a key in this idea of a new form of governance for the world?
This is an important part of the solution. My emphasis today tends to be on creating a shift in attitudes. I think that it is important that we as many people as possible, think of themselves in global terms and try to act in order to deal with issues that face us. It's certain that the UN system is not fully adequate to deal with many of these problems, and therefore ideas such as the World Constitution, as various other proposals for improving the UN system have been made, is an important aspect. On the other hand, my impression is that the governments are not ready to deal with a greatly modified structure, and therefore we've got to push on attitude change. And I think it is important that we think as world citizens and also feel in our hearts that we have a responsibility toward all mankind.
Wow. I'm so glad you mentioned that attitudinal shift being the fundamental basis, because that is exactly why we made the movie The World Is My Country about Garry Davis, because in such very simple terms that everybody can understand, with a riveting story that takes us into it, he helps people redefine themselves as citizens of the world. And he said, when we make that click in our mind to being citizens of the world, then suddenly all these seemingly unsolvable problems become solvable. And why? Because what do citizens do? Citizens create governance. He mentioned that the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence says it is the right of the people to institute new government. That's reflected in almost every constitution, based on the will of the people. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. So Garry said, why are we knocking ourselves against the wall, trying to beg and plead these government leaders to make change when they can't do it? They're on the wrong civic level. Their loyalty is to the part, not the whole. They stay in power by protecting us against them in this condition of world anarchy. He says, why don't we, the people, just take this brilliant idea of creating our own government of, by, and for the world, which is in a way what you started to try to do with this Earth Constitution. Do you see some chance, especially now that we're seeing how broken the old nation state system is, and when we see young people striving for something new and seeing beyond borders, do you see the possibility now of becoming, of the young people today being the James Madisons and Dolly Madisons and Thomas Jeffersons, of inventing a whole new, better way that we, the people, can govern our world so we can survive? Do you see that possibility emerging?
There is certainly a drive and an energy which is new among many young people, and that we see manifested in the concern about the climate, about the ways in which we use our resources, and which we see these days with the COP26. I'm not sure that many of the people who are actively involved in this aspect are thinking in institutional terms. I think we still have to rely to a certain extent on earlier work, which was driven more in terms of institution building than today. And this is why, going back to the Chicago Constitution, to the Earth Constitution, to the Clark and Soane proposals, there is a fairly wide literature of proposals. And among these, there are ways of, I think, reworking some of the ideas in terms of what is acceptable today. So we have to keep pushing, because we're never sure what door is going to open.
Exactly.
We need to open doors and keep pushing, and we have new players. One of the important changes from 47, 48 is the rise of China. Some see this in hostile terms, but it's certain that China is a player today in the UN, in the world scene, that it was not in 47, 48 period.
So let me go back a little bit. Yes, that's very important about China, and so important that we avoid this idea of going into a new Cold War with China and Russia. I mean, that's the most insane thing. It's sort of like, well, there's actually, it leads into another question. It's like choosing extinction. I mean, why would we, just so a few industries can make so much money on this Cold War and can manipulate the right players, why would we be going into $1 trillion effort to create weapon systems that's only function is to make the human race extinct? This incredible little YouTube video where a dinosaur comes treading into the UN and comes up to the front of the podium and says, wait a minute, folks, we know a thing or two about extinction. Don't choose extinction. Is there a way that we can work with that Economic and Social Council and that kind of creative ad to help move people to not choose extinction?
I think that, as I say, the shift in attitude is very necessary, but is also ongoing. And from my experience with people at the United Nations, with government people at the UN, there is among government representatives an awareness, and in discussions among themselves, the UN as an institution pulls people upward. That is, that the discussions in terms of what is done at the UN is of a higher, more human quality than you find in national parliaments. And one of the things which people do not do, but which is important, is to read the preambles to the resolutions of the UN General Assembly. The core of the resolutions are often fairly banal. Nevertheless, if you read the preamble, if you read the justification for the resolution, you will find a remarkable amount of world consciousness. And I think that more people should read UN resolutions than do.
Yes. Well, I think that's so important that you mentioned the preamble, because the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that every individual and every institution of society shall strive constantly to implement these plans. So often we get these UN resolutions and we expect governments to implement them. There's fantastic world law that's already out there. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the one on the rights of women, the rights of indigenous people, the Law of the Seas Treaty, and so on. And we see that governments are failing to enforce these, even though they're required by treaty. They're legally there, but they need an enforcement body. Well, what if we took that preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights seriously, and we, the people, as Garry said, actually got together and create a way that we can enforce these laws in every institution of society, as you mentioned, all the NGOs and so on. And it doesn't mean we enforce them by military power and by sending in arms. You know, Garry said that's old stuff. That's the weak force. That just makes more enemies. That doesn't give you any power, real power. There's no such thing as military power. That's 20 years of superpowers trying to beat the people in Afghanistan and can't do it. Soviet Union couldn't before. Shows there's no such thing as military power, just like Vietnam showed that. The real power is nonviolence and now people turning things around and people instituting law. What are some ways that we could move to, people have talked about, for instance, divesting from industries that are involved in war and violating world law. What do you envision as some ways that we, the people, might be able to actually work directly to implement these things without waiting for the old broken nation state system to do it?
One is to remind governments of the resolutions and the treaties that they have in fact signed. And this is why in our appeals, which we do very often to governments, we always cite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Declaration on Protection of Human Rights Defenders, etc. So depending on what the issue is, governments have in fact signed many important treaties, and again, very often the preambles to these treaties give very strong justifications for the treaty. So that I think it's important to say these resolutions are not drafted by NGOs over 3 beers. These are treaties that have taken many years to do. And as you probably know, in January of next year, all of January, there is going to be the review conference on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, the NPT review, which should have been held this year. It's held every 5 years, should have been held this year. It was postponed because of the COVID thing. So that, again, I've participated and I have chaired the NGOs in 75 and 80 for the first 2 review conferences. It took 10 years of discussions in order to draft the resolution on the NPT. And I've sort of looked at other arms control resolutions that were developed in Geneva, and nearly all took 10 years. Discussions between those people negotiating and the ministries of foreign affairs or whoever, and ministries of defense, etc., who were involved. So that the treaties that we have are not a reaction to a specific situation, but have taken 10 years of reflection. And so what we say is, look, this is your treaty, not ours. We're asking you, there is Article 6 of the NPT, which talks about general and complete disarmament. We haven't seen complete and enforceable disarmament. We didn't write it, you wrote it. What steps have you taken? So I think that we have a role, a first role, to say to governments, look, you didn't do it.
Right.
If you do it, we might have to work something out so that some other way is done.
Well, that leads right into Garry Davis, because when he interrupted the United Nations General Assembly, in the midst of the squabbling back and forth about for instance, the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with the Soviets saying this is an intrusion on our internal sovereignty, and with the Soviets saying we need to have economic rights, and the U.S. saying we need to have political rights. Anyway, it all squabbling. Gary leapt up and said, and called on them to institute a government of, hold elections for the people, elections of, by, and for the people of the world. And he said, if we need one government for one world, and if you won't do it, step aside, and a People's World Assembly will arise from our ranks to do it. Well, I'm hoping that maybe with all that's happening now, if we can get our movie out widely enough, we can inspire a People's World Assembly to arise from our ranks to do it. What do you think of in this world of all this turmoil, of focusing efforts on trying to bring about that rise from the people, of a People's World Assembly?
I think this is a very important aspect, and it's one that is growing, both out of frustration that our current institutions are not dealing adequately with the challenges that we face. There was a article in the press today. The first draft of the COP 26 meeting was given out today, and usually the first draft, as was pointed out, tends to be fairly ambitious, and then governments negotiate to water it down. What struck observers, including the press, was that this first draft is in fact very weak and does not deal with the fossil fuel issues. As a result, there is a disappointment with what the governments are willing to do, because the first draft is already weak, and they're going to weaken it probably more. So there is one frustration, two hope. There is a drive, an energy, which we see in young people, but also not limited to young people.
Right. Well, it's not surprising when 504 of the delegates are actually representing to COP 2026, are actually representing the fossil fuel industry. Why should the fossil fuel industry have delegates to a World Climate Conference? They're the problem. It's the dead fossils, the dinosaurs that died, that are the petroleum we're pumping out to create our own extinction. We're taking one extinct species and using it to extinguish our own. Can there be anything more insane? But rather than go into that as a question, because that's sort of a statement really, I would like to take the time, because we're 10 minutes away from where we're going to turn to questions. And I really want to get to talk to you about your personal connection with Garry Davis. Tell us about when you first met Garry Davis and your experiences in relation to him.
Yes. So, as you know, and as comes out in the film, but not in great detail, when Garry, after spending 2 years in Europe, both in France, at the UN, etc., which is the most spectacular part of his European stay, and then also went to Germany, because having been involved directly in the bombings of Germany, etc., he returned to the United States, and on the ship bringing him back, he met an Indian philosophy professor who had been working in Geneva for many years, and who was part of a school of philosophical thought, basically centered in southern India. And Garry became very interested in this Indian teacher. I don't use the term guru, but in fact, that's the term that's usually used. Had a disciple, follower, if you like, who was his US representative, and who brought around him a certain number of people interested in the thinking. It turned out that Jacobsen lived an hour away from where I lived in New Jersey, and we got in touch through an Indian philosophy professor who I had met at Princeton, and who also went to this farm on weekends, etc., and who said, you should come and join us and join in the discussion. So I started going to Harry Jacobsen's farm to discuss, and Garry Davis would also come on the weekends, because when Garry came back to the States and decided that he would not immediately go back into Broadway musical work that he had been doing before the war, but he needed a job. And as you know, in the States, being simply unemployed is not a title that one wants to have. So Harry Jacobsen gave him a job in his tool shop, but the link was really not to make tools, but it was that both Jacobsen and Garry Davis were interested in philosophical thought. And so on the weekends, a certain number, 5 or 6 people, it was never a mass, but there was Garry, sometimes accompanied by a girl from New York, and Jacobsen, and often this Indian philosopher professor, but not the guru, simply a man who was also, and we would discuss, and my parents were members of the Theosophical Society, which is an association of people very much influenced by Indian thought. So Indian philosophy was familiar to me. I had been a undergraduate assistant of a Chinese philosophy professor who was Chinese, and so I was familiar both, in a sense, with Indian and Chinese philosophical thought, so that with Garry we would discuss Asian thought that many people in the World Federalist, World Citizen movement that Garry had been involved with before going to Europe, and saw again when he returned, tended to be liberal Protestants, or not particularly oriented toward Indian or Asian thought, so that he had relatively few friends in the movement who were Asian thought oriented. So we hit it off well. And then a good deal later, 1967, when he came back to Europe and was living in France and Switzerland, we saw each other relatively often, but always with this common interest in Asian thought.
Oh, tell us a little bit more about what Garry was like over those years working with him, or any maybe key story of something you remember with him that was kind of remarkable.
Well, one of the things, and actually David Gallup, who I see is also among the listeners, when Garry was in India in the mid-50s, at the ashram, as they're called, at the center of this Indian guru movement, the movement used to publish a journal called Values. And at one point, the editor, who was, if I recall correctly, an Australian, had to leave for 6 months for X reasons, and asked Garry to edit the journal in his place. And so Garry wrote an editorial. It was a monthly, as I recall, a monthly editorial reflecting both the thought, the Indian philosophy thought, and linking it to world government, world citizenship. It would be interesting, and as I say, David Gallup sent me, because I asked him, some photocopies of Garry Davis's editorials. It would be interesting for you, or X, to have the whole collection. There must be 6 or 7 editorials, and bring them together into a single little publication, because it's an aspect of Garry's thinking which is relatively not known by the people in the world citizenship, world government movement.
Well, I know you've often talked about really a spiritual basis to the work that you're doing, and the need to see ourselves as connected to humanity as a whole. So I'm going to actually turn it over to questions in a minute, but let me give you one more opportunity. Is there any kind of personal interaction you remember with Garry? You met each other at your homes and so on over many years, that kind of struck you as remarkable or inspiring or interesting? Any little personal anecdote that we might not have seen in the movie?
No, I think that we, as I said in the little text that I wrote for the Paris Garry Davis days, the flag which Garry Davis designed in order to represent world citizenship, which is the person within the globe with the arms outstretched, is understandable basically if one knows the Indian thought of the chakras, within the body of the individual. There are wheels there are 7 wheels within the body that turn and render strong the chakra which is related to that part of the body. So that there's the 3rd eye within the forehead, there's a chakra in the throat, there is one in the heart, there's one in the solar plexus, etc. And so Garry Davis's person is a reflection of these chakras, and so was not replaced by a dove, which the Association of World Citizens uses the dove, which is more universal, as a peace symbol. But Garry stuck with the human figure. And as I say, it's understandable if one knows the Indian thought of the ways in which energy is distributed within the body and makes for knowledge. And yes, the top is the top of the head, which is the opening to the cosmic energy. So I think that Gary's insistence on using the flag, on using that image of the flag, is a reflection of his values and attitudes, and is not perhaps that widely known by people in the world citizen movement.
Okay, well, very, very good. Well, that is so inspiring. I had never actually heard that explanation of the flag. Even in my years talking to Garry, we didn't know that it was based on the chakras. So that is very inspiring. Well, thank you so much. This is incredible. I'm going to now turn it over to questions because we've got other people who want to ask you things, and then I'll come back on to finish up with you.
Okay.
But first, let me turn this now over to Melanie.
Thank you, Arthur and Renee. Oh my gosh, so fun to hear your stories of Garry and your incredible work that you're doing. And we do have questions. I want to go to Michael first. Michael, go right ahead with your question, comment.
Oh, wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. Always thrilling to hear more about Garry Davis. Thank you for all of those insights. My question is about COP26 and the structure of COP26 and how, we see world governments on the hot plate for making these big commitments, and then Arthur mentioned these corporations that are doing these kind of odd sponsorships and like, what is their goal? But shouldn't the corporations themselves have, their CEOs there, and they're the ones who should really be making some big commitments, because they're the ones making decisions at the corporations that do a lot of the exploitation and do drive the world economies in the big ways, and the big shipping companies and so on. So I would question what might be done to improve COP, and then also the governments, one of the commitments they could do, why don't they eliminate fossil fuel subsidies straight away? And I don't know what's been happening there, or if those kinds of commitments are being made by the governments.
The problem is that corporations do not have consultative status. So you have governments and non-governmental organizations in consultative status with the Economic and Social Council, who have an ability to participate in meetings if they are considered relevant. So one of our World Citizen movement in Brussels has been, or is still at Glasgow for the COPE conference, representing a world citizen attitude toward the issues. Corporations do not. So corporations have to come under a false flag. But corporations know where power lies. And so they know in advance that the fossil fuel issues were going to come up, if not by governments, then by non-governmental organizations, and therefore they sent 500 and some people under as part of various delegations, sometimes of governments, more often part of alliances of industries, but not an individual corporation, not an individual company. But they know, and they have money to take people out for lunch or buy a drink, or this sort of thing, so that they are very active. And also, this isn't the first thing that they've done, so they know what countries, Saudi Arabia, etc., are likely to support their issues, so that they are there. It's, I believe, up to us as non-governmental people afterwards to push ever harder and to cooperate more and more.
Well,
I believe that we can, but we have to be as clever as are the people who represent the oil, coal, etc. companies.
yes, it's tragic, awful, crazy. That's why world citizens unite, and we can do this. And actually, Phil has an idea for after the COP26. Go ahead, Phil.
COP26 is as far as I'm concerned, may as well never have happened, because if you believe that past is prologue, you know that all the other previous conferences have failed. And my personal belief, before I get to my point, is that every single delegate to these bodies, to these conferences, is safe. Can you think of one person who had to scrape car fare to get to them and back? They're all safe people. They'll be the last to go. They've assured this. Having said that, when I was with the Democratic World Federalists in San Francisco, we, a subtext to action, we pushed the idea that the end result we all want doesn't necessarily come from the same direction. It can come from many directions. And one of the things we were considering, that I've tried to push personally, is getting the UN, which is the closest thing we have to a world deliberative body, to get real and engage the Article 109 in its own charter, which is basically a 10-year re-examination of the body itself and its purposes and direction. And my notion is that since basically these leaders have failed us and will continue to do so because their personal positions trump everything else, I think serious consideration should be given to picketing the UN in a way, make it festive and make it creative, not a drag, and people demanding that Article 109 be engaged, at least that. And that's my idea for the day.
Yes, as you know, much of the World Federalist, World Citizen movement in the first half of the 1950s was based on the idea that there would be a review conference linked to the article of the Charter in 55. After 10 years of existence, there would be a review conference. And a great deal of time and energy was given over to what should be proposed, etc. As you probably know, the Soviet Union and the United States didn't want a review conference because they feared that they would be criticized. And therefore, there was an agreement between the two great powers not to have a review conference. The review idea was pushed under the rug and has never been swept out. In replacement, there was a committee on strengthening the charter created, in which governments and NGOs proposed a certain number of measures, none of which were put into practice. So the 109 article continues to exist. I would certainly support a review conference. My own impression is that things are going to be piecemeal. There will be a stronger UN environment agency replacing the environment program. There may be a strengthening of the refugee effort because of migration. I see things in terms of piecemeal growth, given that governments are reluctant to have a broad conference, but I can be wrong, and it's certainly worth continuing floating the possibility because it is in the charter, and it was one of the agreements in 45 vis-a-vis small states led by some of the smaller states present, Australia in particular, that the great powers in the Security Council had too much power, that the veto would weaken the organization, etc., and were given Article 109 as compensation, shut up, but in 10 years, we'll look at things in terms of what has happened.
Wow. Oh my.
9 years later, they didn't want it.
Oh gosh, it's heart-wrenching. Goodness, we want to now go to David Gallup, president of the World Service Authority. David, go right ahead.
Renee, so great to see you. We've had a lot of wonderful interactions over the last few years talking about Garry, mostly by email, but it's so delightful to see you in person. One of these days, either I hope to see you here or for me to see you either in France or Switzerland in the next year or two. So thank you for all that you are doing to promote world citizenship. We're on the same path, and I'd love to see us have a chance to work together even more. So let me just show really quickly what Renee was talking about. You can see here's one of the articles that Garry wrote in Values magazine, where he talked about relativist thinking versus holistic thinking, and what he learned from his philosophical teachers, both Harry Jacobsen and Natarajan Guru. But there's a whole bunch more. So at some point, this could be something we could put up perhaps on the worldismycountry.com website, but a whole bunch of articles that Garry wrote. And this is the fellow, and I can't remember his name, that Renee, you were talking about, who was that I'm pointing to right here, who was the main editor of Values magazine. So anyway, interesting capsule of time in the 1950s view of world citizenship back then, which we should go back to, because every time I read something that both Renee writes or that Garry has written, I'm always astounded by how those ideas resonate so well and are so important to be considering today for resolving the problems that we're living with. So I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today, Renee, and I'll stop the share.
Thanks, David.
Wonderful.
Continue all of your good work, because you are certainly carrying the flame today, and the passport aspect is an important symbol, but also a way in which people can move from country to country, or to have a citizenship when their citizenship, as we see with the Rohingyas from Burma, have been deliberately taken away from them.
Yes, yes. Thank you both for continuing your work. Yes, so important. Now we have time for one more comment. Tex wrote, when a science-based grand narrative of the universe is infused with the humanities, it becomes a cosmology, an origin story, and unifying worldview for our time, unifying the person with the cosmos and Earth. Deep Time Network, founded by Jennifer Morgan and collaborators Brian and Swimi in this conversation. So he gives a Vimeo of a brief overview of DTN and the ongoing Deep Time Leadership and Personal Empowerment Program. Well, thank you for that, Tex. Did you have anything to say about that, Renee, or back to Arthur?
Well, this is why the early thinking of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin is very important. And when Teilhard de Chardin was writing, his views were in a sense too advanced for the Catholic Church at the time, and he was sidelined and sent to New York because he didn't speak English. But his thinking was very important, and he had this vision that we need to move ever upwards, and that as humanity moves upwards, there is a convergence and not a separation. And I think that there are certainly people since Teilhard who are thinking along the same lines. But he had a poet's, being a scientist, but nevertheless had a poet's use of language. And I think that his writings are important. They've been translated into English, but exist originally in French, and can touch people who may not know him by other ways.
Goodness, and thank you. We have one more comment from Marge. Marge, did you want to say that real quick, and we'll fit that in really quick? Marge is from Burma.
I joined you because I wanted to know what else is going on with people around the world who's concerned about the environment and immigrants and humanity, basically. We had elections last year, November 8th, and the Aung San Suu Kyi, who was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, her party won the election, but the day she was going to be starting parliament on February 1, just like Trump did, the military challenged her, dubious. They suggested election fraud, so people, of course, protested, and a lot of innocent young people are being killed, despite their peaceful protests. And now the military is engaging war against its own people, not just the ethnic minorities, but its own people, the majority Burmans. And the exiled troops are now retaliating with arms. That's causing another crisis. So there's basically civil war going on. And China is a big problem. Yeah. And of course, the Bangladesh, Burma, the border is very close. They can be wiped away with floods when climate change happens. They really got to do something about it. Anyway, that's all. I just wanted more aware about how to tackle the UN. They're kind of like pretty pathetic. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Renee, thank you, Marge. This is heart-wrenching, it just makes you sick. I mean, this can't go on. And in fact, it won't go on, because we have to make a change. We have to get on this other path. We can't continue with the military rule that we have all over the world, and
Mhm.
it's tragic. So yeah, we're on this other path. You and I and everyone here, we're on this other path, and we're going down this path.
Mhm.
We're welcoming other people down this path. We're not going to play that game. We're not going to get into
Mhm.
that. We're not going to be okay with that. So thank you for reminding us of and letting us know what exactly is going on in Burma. And with that, I want to thank René deeply, deeply for being here. And I quickly pass it to Arthur. We're almost out of time. Arthur, take it away.
President Kennedy said to the United Nations, mankind must abolish the weapons of war, or the weapons of war will abolish mankind. And today he would have said humankind. And that is what we're seeing. These weapons of war that we thought were going to defend us are destroying us all over. We're seeing how that's taken up all the resources that could be saving our planet from the environment and all these other things. So we have, as Melanie mentioned, it's so important to take this alternative path. And it's so great to have René inspiring us on it. And sometimes it seems challenging, that things seem sort of hopeless, but very often it's just before that, when so many people in the world are waking up to this reality, that it's time for a major shift, and we want to be part of planting that. So thank you so very much, René, for being on with us. Before I mention next week's guest, let me first ask René, what are the best ways for people to get on you have an incredible list you send out of information. I think you may even have a Facebook page or other ways that people can keep up with what you're doing. How can people stay tuned in to the important work that you're doing?
Thank you. I'm certainly most happy to have participated, and having, through my daughter, learned how to use Zoom, I hope that I can participate in other discussions that you organize. I've sent to Melanie the two websites of the Association of World Citizens. I think that people can read there, but I'm also happy to receive emails, and although often fairly busy, I try to answer, and I'm so happy to hear the concerns and the interests of everyone. And so I certainly hope that this opportunity of being on your program will be a door open to other exchanges that we can have, both you and your team, but also people who have joined us from outside.
Well, thank you so much. I just want to say how heartwarming and how very special it is to have you here, and how you've managed to span from the personal, the heart, to the global level, to so much crucial change for our world. Next week's speaker is a reflection of that. Just as you were a part of the very early efforts to create an Earth Constitution, and as that was started to work in 1977, before we had all these people interactively involved on Zoom and in this new interactive world. Our speaker next week is someone who's part of a new kind of constitution called the Seeds Constitution for the World, that's very much involved in this new cyber age. Garry invented this idea of a kilowatt dollar, that we could create our own currency. We don't have to be stuck in this old broken financial system. Reiki Corden, and he is part of a bottom-up effort for we the people to create a whole new financial system for our planet. You see all these cyber currencies coming out. Many of them are all just to make money for individuals, speculation. How can we create a currency that actually creates a current between all of us on the planet, that revitalizes our planet and regenerates it and brings it to life? How can we create interactive governing systems where we, in these kind of Zoom type conferences, as Garry envisioned, are interactively working on how do we bring to the top the best ideas for how do we improve and fix, and how do we save our world, how do we govern our world, how do we enforce this wonderful body of international law that's all good on paper, but now needs to actually be enforced in reality. So this is wonderful to have all of you a part of this incredible podcast. And I want to also mention, you have talked specifically that you would like to be more a part, now that you've learned Zoom, more a part of these conferences. Well, if you go to Go to theworldismycountry.com and just click right there. You'll see People Powered Planet right in the middle of the page. Go to theworldismycountry.com, click on the People Powered Planet, and there, that will take you to where you can sign up. Just click at the top, instant Zoom link. It'll take you down to the bottom where you can sign up. So every week you get to hear about our amazing speakers. You get to join us next week in hearing this talk by Reiki, and you get to hear many more wonderful speakers, and you'll also see some past ones there you can review. You can hear David talk about the incredible ways that the World Passport has been used to help people even just to be able to open bank accounts, get their kids in school, get shots, whatever. You'll also hear about give an identity to the 50 million who have no identity. Search through some of those wonderful Beatrice Finn of ICANN that got the Nobel Prize for their work on nuclear war. Any last word before I sign us off? Anything last you want to throw in?
Oh, I want to thank everyone for their participation, and it's great to have been all together.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Join us next week and every week for the next edition of the People Powered Planet podcast.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, you know we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.